All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. I'm joined by Dr. Schmitz, who is a professor of population and community ecology at the Yale University School of the Environment. Dr. Schmitz's research studies the linkage between two important components of natural systems, biodiversity and ecosystem services. Additionally, his research focuses on how important environmental disturbances such as climate change and natural resource exploitation impact species interactions and ecosystems and ensuing ecosystem services. And finally, Dr. Schmitz is also the author of the book, The New Ecology, Rethinking a Science for the Anthropocene. So, Dr. Schmitz, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
So, when did you first get interested in ecology?
It's ever since my childhood. I grew up in a very rural part of Ontario, Canada, and it was a small town, and it was still in those days when parents let their kids run amok in the fields and in the woods, and we were able to, as boys, just run around and just experience nature, and that's where I saw things, and really a lifelong interest in figuring out how things work, how nature works, what's the rules of life driving, how ecosystems function.
Yeah, definitely being able to explore as a kid, I think really gets people curious about how the world works.
Oh,
And
for sure.
seeing
Yeah.
things like, what is this? What is this creature, I saw? Or
Yeah. Yeah.
that's cool. And so, thinking about the environment, how has climate change been impacting biodiversity and ecosystems around the planet then, in your estimation, from studying this topic for such a long time?
Yeah, it has both beneficial and detrimental effects depending on what species. If you're a warm loving species, it's actually beneficial for you. But if you're at your limit in terms of your ability to tolerate warm climate, it can push you to the brink. So there isn't any uniform single outcome that's necessarily happening. Some species are thriving. Other species are not able to live in parts of their ranges because they're too hot. So their geographic ranges are shrinking. If they're living in suboptimal conditions, their ability to survive and reproduce diminishes, and so population sizes of species are going down. So it can be detrimental, but not necessarily so for all species.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose also that the ability for a species to adapt to sort of rapidly warming climate is quite difficult. Usually that might be something you might be able to get away with, I guess, over a long period of time. Or
Well, actually, we're discovering through climate change
yeah.
that some species are a lot more adaptable. The
Okay.
evolutionary process doesn't take quite as long. They can evolve very quickly
Interesting.
within decades rather than the millennia that we used to think. But there's also an ability on the part of organisms, what we call phenotypic plasticity, and it's a level of flexibility, a degree of flexibility that animals have and plants. In that they can adjust their physiology or they can adjust their behavior to sort of mitigate some of the local effects. So animals might seek out cooler habitats for longer parts of the day, or they change their metabolism. They rate of metabolism gets adjusted so that they can cope with the warmer temperatures.
Are we seeing also as a result then potentially animals like migrating more to try to get into a climate they're more comfortable with? Or
That's part of what we expect to happen.
okay.
As you get a warmer environment, you move further away from where you normally are, simply because you have more optimal environments now starting to happen in other geographic locations. So you see animals moving. But one of the challenges for that on the planet is that we've got so much built infrastructure everywhere, roads and
Yeah.
houses and cities and things. They tend to get in the way of animals and plants' ability to move along long corridors or whatever. And so we actually have to, when we're designing urban areas and designing our infrastructure, we actually have to be mindful now of what we're going to do to the ability of non-human species to actually cope with climate change through migrations. It's a big conservation urban planning issue that we really need to start addressing more actively.
Yeah. And what's the impact also on like environments they're moving into that maybe they don't necessarily typically would go in, but it's better than what they were in? Or is that?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to move to an environment that is more suitable than your existing environment. Otherwise, there's no compelling reason to move. You know, it's actually
Yeah.
costly to move. Um, but you know, the new environments are novel environments, so you know some animals especially might freak out when they get into these environments because they've never been there before. It's a new neighborhood, if you will. They don't know who else is living there. There may be other predators, and that's another issue that's happening, is that you know it isn't just one species moving, it's a community of species moving, and you may end up forging new predator-prey relations and things like that. So, you know, animals have to be on their guard a little more when they're moving and looking out for what they're going to encounter.
Yeah. So I guess then I'm curious, thinking about the potential for an animal to go extinct and sort of removing them from an environment, how does that sort of impact the biodiversity of that place?
If they do go extinct, then obviously the number of species will go down, the biodiversity in terms of number of species. It could also happen that important interdependencies are disappearing. So, for example, if a plant species goes extinct, all of the pollinators that depend on it, or all of the herbivores that depend on it, their livelihoods may be compromised. And if they're specialized on that one plant, then they may go locally extinct also. So that's actually, I think, the bigger issue in the global biodiversity crisis. It isn't so much that species themselves are going extinct in leaps and bounds. It's local populations of species are going extinct. So globally, where these animals historically have lived, it's shrinking. The space where they live
Yeah.
now is shrinking. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess then there's kind of like a domino effect if they're eventually gone, because everyone's in trying to adjust to the fact that they're not there anymore. Animals that might have had, a reliance on them for food, um, or ones that perhaps are no longer being hunted or eaten will then
Yeah.
all of a sudden explode in population, perhaps.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess it's kind of like removing a puzzle piece all of a sudden
It
and
is.
readjusting everything.
Or
Interesting.
more like a Jenga puzzle,
Yeah.
really. You
Yeah.
pull out one block and things could
Yeah.
collapse on you. So
Yeah.
they may or may not. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And so what would you say then is like sort of the current projected impact of climate change on wildlife around the world? What type of extinction level, is there a potential for? So
I it's hard to really make exact predictions. Part of the reason is that most of the forecasts for what's going to happen to biodiversity doesn't really factor in this plasticity, this adaptability part of the equation that I was just talking about. So, you know, animals and plants have coping mechanisms to deal with climate change, and so they may be more resilient than we're actually giving them credit for right now. So obviously the prognosis is really very pessimistic, based on conventional ways of thinking about, you know, the ability of organisms to tolerate. And that gets back to what you raised earlier at the beginning of our discussion, that it takes, you know, the view has been that it takes, you know, thousands, if not
yeah.
hundreds of thousands of years to adapt evolutionarily. And that mindset is actually what's behind the way people are making forecasts about biodiversity loss due to climate change. And you know, through that, or not just climate change, also global change in general, habitat loss, you know, changing the environment because we're converting land to other uses. And you know, the prognosis is kind of dire. You know, 30 to 40, maybe even 50% of the species will be lost by the turn of the next century. But again, it doesn't account for this adaptability that organisms might have.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. to think about because I mean, if you think about sort of the history of the planet and how many things life has had to endure over time from different climate changes over time that were not caused by people, and there's been huge extinctions, but life still survived, and the sort of planet would repopulate with different animals. Have there been particular populations that you found in your research that you could give examples of that basically did much better than people thought they would?
Um, I I'm not up on really exact case examples of that, because what we're right now doing is just discovering through the research, the ability to be plastic
Yeah.
and which kinds of species tend to be. And it turns out that, obviously what's counterintuitive is species that are living in very hot climates, and this is true for insects and arthropods in general. The ones that live in particularly hot climates, you would think that they could tolerate the heat, they're used to it, but actually climate change might push them to the brink a lot quicker than species that live in cooler environments in more northern geographic regions, because they're more accustomed, the northern ones are more accustomed to the wide fluctuations in temperature that you experience
Oh,
over a season, right? And so they're much more adapted to dealing with that sweeping huge change that they encounter during the year, whereas in the tropical regions there isn't much of a sweeping change, right? It's pretty steady change, and so they don't have the machinery to be flexible as much as species in northern realms. So it's kind of counterintuitive.
yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I never thought about that. So like animals, I guess, that live in the Midwest would be a much different situation than animals that live in Florida or something.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
really fascinating.
yeah, yeah. But again, one this is the interesting thing with climate change. It's a big experiment. It's in a sense that you can look at it as a big experiment. We don't want it to be an experiment because it could
Sure.
have devastating potential for everybody. But it is an experiment that's causing scientists to continually change how they've been thinking about the world. And part of the reason is we haven't been able to, as scientists, do experiments on the scale at which climate change is happening. So we couldn't really impose the kind of changes that we're seeing now, and really being able, the thing is we've been able to measure and be on top of it and measure what's happening. But yeah, it's somewhat an unprecedented time in the history of science, even on the planet.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess then like all the things that you can potentially learn from this could be used. Who knows what future climate will look like, but
Yeah,
it can help you sort of create a game plan, perhaps for sort of conservation efforts of
right,
animals
right, right.
as a result.
Well, and right now the thinking is, let's not think about species. Let's think about the populations of species. So, for example, think of a widespread species that ranges from Florida to the Midwest. Obviously, local populations live in different environments, and so the local populations, the ones in, let's say, in Florida, they're pushed up higher up, and they have to cope with warm temperature always, and the other populations have to deal with the fluctuating temperatures. So you get different adaptations in the populations. And so when conserving species, when thinking about, how do we rescue species from extinction in the face of climate change, what we need to do is take what's called a portfolio effect, where we have individuals from all the different populations. So you have a portfolio of different strategies, and keep them present, so that at least there'll be some kind of population that can survive a future kind of climate change. And so we're moving also away from thinking about species conservation to population conservation.
Okay. I guess that, yeah, that makes sense because it gives you that sort of a little bit more detail about what you're dealing with as a
Yeah,
problem
yeah,
instead of just, having kind of this one glove fits all strategy.
exactly.
Just as you would for like different societies around the world trying to help them out. They have different environmental problems than perhaps other places have. So,
That's right. That's right.
okay, that's interesting. And so, obviously climate change is one of the major issues that sort of impact life on the planet. But what about as you mentioned before, urbanization and removing forests? To what extent? How does that compare in terms of its impact?
Well, historically, habitat destruction was much more harmful to species than climate change. Again, the reason being, when you destroy habitat, you destroy the home completely. There are no rooms in the home where you can sort of seek shelter, right? Even if it's a stormy day, if you have your house,
Yeah,
you have a place to sleep and shelter. If the habitat's gone, though, there is no shelter, and so that makes species then vulnerable to other disturbances or environmental factors like climate change. So habitat destruction has been probably the most important, and that's habitat destruction is happening. It's a global change that's happening because we have to feed a burgeoning population. So people are, tearing down forests or other areas and converting them to other land uses. We also have growing populations that want to live in homes, and so we have to eat up land so we can build houses and whatnot. And so, it's a zero-sum game on this planet in some sense, although not necessarily. In terms of space available for everything we want to do on the planet, it's a finite planet and we have to divide up the space. But again, we're finding some interesting things. Is that we typically view nature as places where there are very few people or no people at all. So cities and towns are not considered nature. But we have to think about that differently because we got to get away from this idea of a human nature divide. Humans are part of nature, and we live in nature regardless of whether we live in a city or in very rural areas or wilderness areas. And the animals also adapt to that. What's interesting is here, even in New Haven, we have small carnivores actually living in neighborhoods, living quite well in neighborhoods.
yeah,
We're thinking of species that were typically denizens of forests, like a fisher, which is a mid-sized carnivore. It feeds on a variety of prey. It specializes on porcupines and things like that. But fishers historically were viewed as a species requiring old growth forests, like old pine forests. But in New Haven, they exist on the outskirts of New Haven and go into the city a little bit because we're actually regrowing the forest, but they're intermingled now with housing, and they're not so afraid of housing and people. What they do is they just change their activity cycles, right? So they're more active at times of the day when people are less active, and so they're making adjustments in their activity, but they're cohabiting with us in all sorts of places. So wild nature can actually be in your backyard in the city.
yeah.
Foxes and coyotes and raccoons and everything are also part of that story.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the number of animals that seem to just adapt to sort of the urbanization, say like I'm still going to live here somehow, and figuring it
Yeah,
out, it is
yeah,
pretty remarkable. Um, and obviously, a lot of people don't pay much attention to them; they'll just walk right by. So they're like, okay, well, I guess I can stay here and figure
yeah.
it out.
Exactly. And again, that's why, the prognoses of doom and gloom, of mass extinction, is sometimes questionable a little bit
Yeah,
because, you see this other side of the story where these animals are actually coping with what people have done to the environment. Um,
yeah.
and building these sort of adaptive capacities into our thinking is required a little more.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool point to make too, because I mean, it seems like people tend to have a little bit of an overreaction to any type of change that happens in the world, especially when it has the potential to cause damage to things like the environment. We don't necessarily always give the planet and its life enough credit for its adaptability
Right.
to those things, and also I think just from a general understanding perspective, like if you're creating this sort of apocalyptic type vision for people in their heads, they're going to be less likely to probably even care. It was like, oh, we can't do anything about it anyway. Why
Yeah,
try?
for sure.
Um,
For sure. And that's why I try to highlight the adaptability of nature, because it sends a hopeful message. It shows us that um, there is opportunity to fix all of our problems. We just need the human will to do it. And we also need humankind to be more respectful of other species and not just sort of ignore them in plain sight type of thing. Like really care about them and do our best to minimize harm to them, even though they might even be living next to us. It's a different ethic. It's not necessarily just conservation, or it's not management. It's a stewardship ethic that we're promoting now. Where we see ourselves as part of nature, and what we want to do is improve the welfare and well-being of all organisms that we live with. And in order to do that, we work to improve environmental quality and have less of a footprint. It's not to say that we should deny our livelihoods and sacrifice our well-being for the sake of other species, but it's really an idea that through our own actions and care for our own environment and care for our fellow person, mutually through the environment, we can actually create an environment that can be beneficial for more than just us.
yeah, I mean, I think that's also something that a cool idea that's I think would go across, especially in the U.S. and in a very sort of politically divided times. Almost everyone likes nature in the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah.
Regardless of their political background. So the idea of being a part of nature, I think, is very appealing to a lot of people.
For sure. And the nice thing is you can do it in your backyard or in your neighborhood,
Yeah.
right? So you actually feel like you're doing something, you're doing your little part for the greater good. It's a way of being a little bit selfish. I like these species as opposed to other ones, and so I'm going to conserve them. But together, if we do this everywhere across the continent, we'll save a lot of biodiversity and care for it into the long-term future.
Yeah. So what are some different things then that people can do individually then to sort of be a part of that process?
In urban areas,
Yeah.
what we can do is just think differently about how we do our gardening. Just something simple as that, where first of all, we can plant perennial plants rather than just always annual plants, and try and use native perennials that are evolved to live in the region that of the country where you live. And what that does is then those plants then attract the insects that use them for food or pollen or whatever. And so you can build up communities of animal and plant species in your garden. It just means you can't look at insects as pests. You got to look at them as part of a flourishing landscape. And so with wildflowers, some will get eaten, others won't. But also thinking about nature and sort of the timeline of nature over the course of a summer. What the mistake a lot of people do is they plant colorful flowers that come out in the spring, but then they forget that you can get wildflowers that bloom in the early summer, midsummer, late summer. So you can have color throughout the year. If you plant things the spring flowers, they're going to be dead, and then your yard's going to look ugly. But what you do is recognize that things flower for a purpose throughout the summer season, and plant those different varieties. So you're enhancing biodiversity, you're using native biodiversity, you're attracting different insects. And it actually benefits the climate too, because you're sucking up carbon out of the air and storing it in your soil. But you need to use perennials so that you don't disturb the soil every year by replanting.
Okay.
But you can actually create a little mini ecosystem in your yard. And again, people will say, well, I'm not going to plant my whole yard with wildflowers because where's the lawn? You can balance that. You can balance. You can get an aesthetic. You can plant English-looking gardens mixed with a bit of lawn, but the lawn space that we actually mow a lot of times is space that we don't often use a lot of. So let it fill in a little more. Only mow and keep open spaces where you're actually going to sit or have a family barbecue or whatever. And the other spaces could be just wildflowers or shrubs and things like that. Um, and that will attract a lot of biodiversity, and as I say, can help. You can do your little part in terms of purifying the air and storing carbon in the soil.
Okay, that's cool. Now, what about like if people? I know some people like to put up bird feeders and stuff. Does that have any contribution at all, or does that do anything? Um,
Bird feeders are really intended to attract birds to a location, right?
yeah.
And certainly it's wonderful to keep them part of it, but I think a lot of times people overfeed the birds, right?
Okay.
So then,
Yeah.
so then what happens is they do quite well. They're fat and they reproduce a lot, and so you could get an explosion in the number of birds
Okay.
locally, right? And so the downside of that is you get an overpopulation of some of them, then people perceive them as pests,
Yep.
but they also when they're in high abundances can carry diseases, and those diseases spread, so we have to be careful. I'm not saying don't feed birds.
Yeah.
I mean, I love to see birds and all sorts of varieties and colors of birds.
Yeah.
Um, but we don't need to do it in the summer when
Okay.
there's ample food around. And we don't need to do it necessarily in the spring, but maybe in late fall and a little bit during the winter to help the local ones thrive. Um, that's fine, but I don't think we need to feed them in the summer. That would be overfeeding them.
Yeah. That's also kind of a cool thing you point out then, because you're talking about the ones that stay for the winter. Those are kind of like your that's kind of like your birds basically that are going to be there.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
take care of your own kind of.
that's right.
That's
Yeah,
an
yeah,
interesting thing. Never thought about that.
yeah.
Um, but cool. Okay. And so, what are you currently working on then in your research?
Well, two things. Again, with the arthropods, the stories I've been telling are ones that I've discovered through my research. That it's really looking at communities of spiders and grasshoppers feeding on vegetation and how that drives the carbon cycle. And we're learning all about this remarkable adaptability of these species that we've just been discussing. But I've also started in a new direction with my research, thinking about the large animals on the planet, and because they roam in vast spaces, and because of their size, they can do much more to change the environment. But in a lot of cases, it turns out these animals are also very, very important for fixing the climate problem. They are important in driving and controlling the carbon cycle, and their presence can actually enhance our ability to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it in the ecosystems. And so what we're trying to do is draw a connection between climate change or the climate problem and the biodiversity problem, and have a win-win solution. By connecting the two, we can solve the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis together.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Using animals as ways of controlling ecosystems.
Yeah. I guess that's kind of the key then, is to find that balance. So then problem could be solved in many different ways.
Well, it can in part, but the problem is, with large animals roaming widely, and they need wide spaces. So you've heard of proposals 30 by 30, right? Conserve 30% of land space by 2030. That's an ambitious goal. It's a fine goal if we don't just parcelize those 30%, right? What we need to do is connect landscapes with 30% of the landscapes need to be connected so the animals can move, and so they can adapt to climate change, or so they can fulfill their life cycles and all that. And so again, in terms of land use planning, we need to think strategically about that. And then when you do that, when you're thinking about these vast spaces, well, people live in these vast spaces, right? We can't just sort of do it all in protected areas and national parks. And so we have to bring local people into the equation again, right? So historically, conservation has said, let's keep people away, let's protect nature from people. But if we're going to do 30 by 30, we have to have the people still be able to live on the landscape and fulfill their livelihoods. We can't just kick them out and move them
Right.
around. And so, you know, the bigger challenge is actually working with local communities and getting their buy-in, first of all, to reintroduce a large herbivore. Let's say, you know, one of the things in North America is bison reintroductions in parts of the range where they historically have been absent, but there's cattle ranching going on, and the ranchers worry that these herds will move and destroy their property, let alone spread disease. So you have to work with local communities and sort of come up with agreements on what land spaces will be allocated for these purposes. But what we can also do is ask of these local communities to help be stewards of that environment, right? Not just say, okay, you have to accept this, but actually help them, you know, learn to be stewards of their local environments. Because as you said, people like nature, they want to live with nature and they want to be part of it. And there's opportunity also to pay people for that stewardship, right? So
Yeah.
if you're, let's say, a cattle rancher and you're on the margin in terms of your productivity or your financial well-being, maybe it'll pay the farmer to say, or the rancher to say, okay, I'm going to lessen how much livestock I'm raising and maybe open land to conserve bison. We should pay them for that service, right? And it's another income stream. And because it's a consistent one, it will be a regular annual income to support their livelihood in addition to the cattle ranching. But what you have to do then is work out a way where they'll be willing to accept the risk of a disease outbreak, you know, like brucellosis or something. However small it is, there might still be a risk. And so you have to have an agreement on what to do in the event of that happening. Do you compensate them for the loss of the cattle because of that? And, you know, so you know, too much of conservation right now is still in the hands of philanthropy.
Mm.
And to me, philanthropy is not a viable long-term strategy for conservation, because the organizations that do the funding, they change their priorities, and so then funding disappears. So what we have to do is come up with viable models to pay people for the stewardship services they offer to the broader public good, and those have to be sort of self-sufficient
Yeah.
local economies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes sense to me that you'd want then local populations to sort of take the reins on that.
Yep.
Just like you're dealing, you're trying to focus on local populations of animal life. The local community of people there could be the ones dealing with that. So they
Yeah.
should,
Yeah.
be sort of empowered to understand how this works. So
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
yeah, that's a cool idea. We've talked a lot about sort of the adaptability of species. What limits are there, do we know of, on adaptability? Like, is there a certain threshold for temperature that we're concerned about? We don't know, I guess, how long global, the climate will continue to warm, and maybe that
Yeah.
adaptability then sort of changes
Yeah.
based on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Um, you know, species evolved in certain environments, and so they have, you know, a range of genetic variation that limits how much they can adapt to new circumstances. And so you know, this idea of plasticity isn't something that's going to just bail us out completely all the time. You know, the degree of plasticity or adaptability is also determined by your genes, and so that is dictated by where you originated to some extent. And so we have to be careful that we don't rapidly change the world at such a pace that you know, it outstrips the organism's ability to express their plasticity, because they don't have the genetic capacity to. Because if they don't, then what you have to do is look for mutations and long-term selection, which does take the millennia to get the new kinds of species that could cope. So we have to worry about that. But we know already for animals physiologically, anytime you go, I deal with Celsius. So anytime you're pushing 38, 39, 40 degrees Celsius body temperature.
Yeah.
So anytime the environment hits you that hard that your body temperature goes that much, you pretty much turn into a boiled egg, right? That's why we
Yeah.
worry about fever, right?
Yep.
So what's really interesting is species can cope with a lot of cold much better than they can cope with heat. And their thermal tolerance curve is really skewed toward being much better able to cope with colder temperatures. There are really upper critical limits that are pretty hard, because just the way our physiology and our proteins work with temperature, there aren't many species that can live beyond temperatures where their body temperature goes beyond 40 degrees Celsius.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
interesting. And um, what would you say is more adaptable than to these climate fluctuations, like arthropods, insects, or like sort of just wild animals, wildlife, like deer and
Yeah, I think the larger you are, the more sort of inertia you have in your body and less ability to cope. So the larger species are the ones that are likely to go first. The
okay.
mammals, the large mammals. The insects can always find little places where they can sort of evade
Yeah.
the hot temperatures and whatnot. Um, it's the larger species that just can't get out of the way of the temperature changes that will be harmed the most.
Yeah. I guess that makes sense since, if you're looking at, I guess, the world from a bug's perspective, it's it's much bigger than for,
Right, right,
yeah.
exactly,
So,
exactly.
all
Yeah.
right. Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And what's the best way for people to follow your work?
You can just go to my website at the Yale School of the Environment. You all you have to do is just type in my name, Yale School of the Environment, and it'll pop up my web's homepage, and you can see all the wonderful things my students are doing. And that's one thing about being a professor. I love being a professor because the students keep you young and
Yeah.
excited. They're the ones who have much hope for the future and keep you going. So
Yeah. That's
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 the fun
definitely
part.
special. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for coming on. I really appreciate you sharing all your knowledge and yeah, sharing information about such a interesting and fascinating topic and also a very important topic for the world today. So
Okay, it was my pleasure, Ben. Thanks for having me.